Welcome to the UN University, headquartered in Tokyo, where we are today. My name is David Malone. I'm privileged to work at the UN University, and we have with us as a guest Professor Mats Berdal, Professor of Security and Development at King's College London. And Mats, this evening in Tokyo, we'll be discussing publicly lessons learned from peace building in Afghanistan, although the adventure in Afghanistan continues, first and foremost for the Afghans, secondly for international actors on the ground. And so I wanted to ask you at the outset, how has the lessons learning process been going internationally? I'm aware that in Norway, a study that you've participated in heavily has tried to draw lessons for the Norwegian government. But what is your sense overall? Are international actors interested in learning from what they've done well, what they've failed at, or is this actually all political theater for the auditors?
Well, I think when it comes to Afghanistan in particular, there has been a real reluctance among more than 50 plus countries that contributed to international involvement to draw lessons. And I think, frankly, one reason for that is that their record is not terribly encouraging if you look back. The Norwegians are in a way an exception, because the Norwegian parliament decided that we had to look at how all that money was spent, whether there was a sensible use of a military, police and development contribution. And therefore we went into great detail. We had access to, if you like, classified material, and we're managing to get a detailed picture of the Norwegian contribution, which, although relatively small in the bigger scheme of things, is nonetheless interesting because it did have its own province it was responsible for, where it tried to stabilize the situation in the north, and it made a key contribution in controversial areas such as intelligence and special forces operations. I think the real question about lessons you ask is a very good one, because there is a tendency sometimes to lump all these experiences together. And I think Afghanistan is, to some extent, and indeed in an important sense, quite unique. And the reason for that is that the war in Afghanistan, when it started in 2001 with the American invasion, was for the United States the opening salvo in the global war on terror. And in a sense, it always remained part of an American counterterrorism operation. It fluctuated over time, there was emphasis on other issues, but that was a driving force. Now, after 2003, for the NATO alliance and for other troop contributors, it also became something more. It became what the Americans called a nation-building exercise. So there was, in a sense, a real tension throughout this mission between what you might call a broad counter-terrorism mandate, the 3 Ds, dismantle, disrupt, and defeat Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And note how the Americans lumped these two together, Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and never really tried to separate them, which you really ought to have done earlier on. Whereas NATO tended to focus increasingly from 2003 onwards on trying to stabilize the country and build, in their own words, a democratic and properly functioning Afghanistan. And the tension between those two makes it unique. Now, where I think there are valid lessons to draw in a general sense, and I think above all, and this applies to Afghanistan and other cases, is to treat a country on its own terms, rather than, as Anatol Lieven, our friend, said, a kind of imagining a Western sort of landscape you can draw upon it. And treating it on its own terms, I think, means above all recognizing that it has a distinct historical, cultural and political context, but also that in the case of Afghanistan, it's been shaped by already decades of conflict and by a very important regional context which you simply cannot ignore.
In my country, Canada, I think the conclusion that was broadly drawn, including by Parliament and others, is that we simply underestimated the challenge. That we thought the rather modest means that we were bringing to bear on perhaps Afghanistan's most challenged province, Kandahar, were grossly inadequate to what turned out to be a growing rather than shrinking set of difficulties. We had thought we were going in after most of the fighting was over to peace build, but actually by the time we left, there was very little to show for Canada's very significant effort, the large number of human casualties, Canadian, Afghan, others, that were incurred. In a way, the situation, because of undue optimism at the outset, that we could somehow produce a Western miracle in Afghanistan, that all of this had been delusional, and actually we'd rather not think about it a lot. In Norway, admirably, there seems to have been a somewhat different approach.
Well, I think, the conclusion we arrived at in the report is not dissimilar from what you just suggested. And I think there is a real sense in which there was a massive over-optimism in the early days. But I do think that the fundamental problem wasn't simply one of resources and institutional capacity. It was that we approached the exercise essentially as one of social, re-engineering, trying to create and transplant modern institutions to a very different and complex foreign setting. And I think what we should have done, and this was made very difficult by the American focus on the 3Ds I mentioned, was to prioritize some kind of political settlement. Now, of course, it was going to be very difficult in 2001 to include the Taliban or the Pashtuns, but there were many instances after then when this idea of having some kind of open or some kind of political dialogue would have been critical. And Francis Vendrell, who was there early on, speaks of a situation where windows keep closing. And I think early on, there was at least a moment where you could have tried to reach out. Because interestingly, the Taliban wasn't so much defeated in 2001 as simply melted away. And of course, in the interest of prosecuting the war of terror, the Americans in particular, with their light footprint, entered into alliances with local warlords who had no particular interest in building the kind of Afghan state you and I are talking about. And you inherited that problem afterwards. So when you begin to extend NATO outside Kabul and into the rest of Afghanistan, you're dealing with these local warlords who frankly are very exploitative and very predatory.
I also think probably the slogan war on terror was unhelpful, because a war on an abstraction is not likely to succeed. Secondly, in a way, it could not succeed. And a second problem might have been that very often military leaderships overestimate what they can achieve and wind up disappointing the political leadership, which tends to believe them. In spite of repeated episodes of over-optimistic military assessments dating back to Vietnam and all sorts of previous exercises.
No, absolutely. And I think the major problem in terms of the way the war was prosecuted by the Americans in particular, because of this focus on, as you say, unhelpfully on a broad and permissive definition of terror, was that, for example, the whole command and control system in Afghanistan, giving special forces very, very broad leeway to do many things which directly undermined some of the stabilization activities of other countries. And that became a very real problem as we enter into 2009, 2010.
But I think each of our countries probably pursued military goals on the ground that undermined our other goals on the ground. In that, I'm not sure the Americans are so different from the rest of capitals in the world, where a conciliation of objectives, a clear prioritization amongst objectives is often difficult to achieve.
Absolutely, and I think you're right about the Canadian and Norwegian approach. I mean, because the Canadians and the Norwegians felt a little bit differently about the emphasis on, on the counterterrorism mandate, very often these different provincial reconstruction teams adopted their own distinctive approaches. And another problem with Afghanistan was that it became a very fragmented mission. You had Germany doing its own things in the north, you had the Norwegians doing its things, and the sort of lack of cohesion was a very, very fundamental challenge throughout the mission.
Indeed. Thank you very much for joining us online. You'll have heard in these few minutes the sorts of issues we are going to be discussing this evening at UNU headquarters. We're very grateful to Mats Berdal for being with us in Tokyo, and to you for joining us today. And if you visit Tokyo in the future from elsewhere in Japan, from around the world, we have public conversations of this sort once or twice a month, nearly always on issues of immediate or long-term interest to the United Nations and governments of the world. So please, if you can, join us one evening live. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mats.
Thank you.